Hello, my name is Amy, and today I am really excited to be talking to you about two grapes. Actually, we call them the king and the queen of grapes in the wine world. They make some of the best wines in the world and are produced also all over the world. They're noble grapes as well. If you haven't guessed by those small little hints, I am, of course, talking about Shiraz or Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon. Let's begin with the queen of the grapes, Syrah or Shiraz. Now, just before we start talking about the grape and its characteristics, I want to clear up one common myth, and that is about the origin of the grape. A lot of people think, because it's also called Shiraz, that the grape originated in Iran, where there is actually a city called Shiraz. And in Iran, they do actually have a grape called Shirazi, but it is totally genetically different to the Shiraz and Syrah that we will be talking about today. So why do Syrah and Shiraz have a different name if they are genetically the same, which of course they are? And the reason for that actually just helps identify the style in which the wine is made. Generally, bottles that say Shiraz tend to be made in a more New World style, which we will come on to a little bit later. And anything that says Syrah tends to be made in a more Old World style. And when I'm talking about Old World, I'm really specifically, or most notably, talking about an area where Syrah is grown. It's known to be the benchmark style of Syrah. It's called the Mecca of the Syrah grape, and it is the area of the Northern Rhone in France. The grape itself actually originated from about 40 kilometers north of the Rhone, but it was discovered to be able to grow incredibly well in the Northern Rhone, and it now produces some of the best wines in the world from that area. Why is that? Well, to give you an idea, the Northern Rhone is an area of France that is very undulating. It's very hilly, lots of rolling hills. Most of the vineyards are planted south facing, and that means they receive optimum sunshine. The Syrah grape is a grape with an incredibly thick skin, and in fact the skin to pulp ratio is really, really big. And what that means is it will naturally produce more robust wines and wines with a lot more colour too, but it also means that it needs enough sunshine, not warmth necessarily, but enough sunshine for the grapes to be able to ripen evenly. In the Rhone Valley, especially the Northern Rhone, this is particularly what we can find. And as well as the area being very hilly, the hills are also really quite steep. So it's not easy winemaking by any estimation. And this also comes into play when we talk about the price of the wines from that area. They say the Syrah grape likes a view, and it's certainly what it gets in the Northern Rhone area. One of the most well-known areas in the Northern Rhone is called the Côte Rôtie, which literally means the roasted coast. And that gives you some idea of the intensity of sunshine that hits the grapes. There are about 73 different crus, so small little areas within that bigger area, and it's really worth doing your homework because every expression of the grape will be slightly different depending on where it's grown and which producer you're looking for. But a seriously good area for growing the Syrah grape is the Côte Rôtie. Just below that, you've got a massive area called Saint-Joseph and Crozes-Hermitage. Now, these two areas are where you can find much better value Rhone wine. So if you don't want to pay the eye-watering prices, which sometimes you'll find from top Rhone, top red Rhone, then these two areas are better. Again, it's really worth doing a little bit of investigation as to who you're buying from, where you're buying from, just to check that they've got the style and the elegance that you want. Something that really is denoted by Northern Rhone reds, Northern Rhone Syrah, is the robustness of the wine, but also the elegance and finesse it has as well. These are wines, I mentioned that the skin is really thick. We know that this also helps with aging, and they are wines that can last for decades. There's a really tiny area called Hermitage, not to be confused with the bigger Gros Hermitage, where when you buy a wine, you need to leave it for at least 5 to 10 years just for it to be soft enough for you to be able to get your lips around it and actually enjoy it. The other area of particular note in the northern Rhone is an area called Cornas, which also produces these very inky, very sort of full-on, elegant Rhone red Syrah wines. It's a shame we can't talk about every single appellation within the Northern Rhone because they are all so fascinating and so delicious. But just the fact it has Northern Rhone on the label will mean that the price for a Syrah grape grown in this region can sometimes be eye-watering, and particularly those grapes that are grown from tiny appellations. Producers know that people are prepared to pay just to have the name Côte Rôtie or a tiny appellation on their label. And the smaller the vineyard area, the more concentrated the production. A lot of these smaller producers, they can't compete with bulk production in the area, and there isn't much of it anyway. And so in order to make ends meet or make their profits, they actually are able to push the prices of their wines up because they know people will pay for them. Now, these are wines, I would say, that need consideration. Sometimes they need time in the bottle to be aged, but particularly you need to understand where your wine is coming from. And that's why I say do your homework. I love a Syrah grape from Northern Rhone, but it is something that for me would definitely need some food with it to fully appreciate it. They tend to be characteristically medium bodied, so I'm not talking about a massively full-on mouthfeel. Medium bodied, medium to high acidity, so food, some kind of meat or mushroom dish would go really, really well with one of these wines. The characteristic telltale of a Northern Rhone Syrah grape is black pepper. And it's a wonderful aroma that you can get from many of the wines made there, as well as typical blackberry, raspberry sometimes, bilberry, violets, just this sort of brooding black fruit that sits on top of the black pepper is a really, really interesting taste to have. My favourite region probably would be the Côte Rôtie, but that is something that I either have to save up for or I have to make sure I'm definitely in the right mood for it as well. As I did say, it needs more thought when you're drinking one of those wines. Now, the other area in the world really known for producing Syrah is Australia, and that's where the name changes to Shiraz. So I mentioned at the very beginning, we have the Old World Syrah, which will be Old World countries, so mainly sort of European countries. And then we have the New World countries, which really tend to be countries that European winemakers colonized and began making wine in them. Australia is one of them, and that's where the wine tends to be called Shiraz. What's really interesting about Australia and Shiraz, though, is although the grape was initially discovered in France and just above the Rhone region, the oldest vines in the world today are actually in Australia. And this is because a gentleman named James Busby, who'd visited France in the 1830s, took some original Shiraz or Syrah vines with him back to Australia and began planting them there. And whilst France was latterly devastated in the 1850s and onwards by this phylloxera sort of aphid bug that destroyed the majority of the vineyards, Australia managed to, for the most part, escape it. So the oldest original vines of Syrah Shiraz are actually now in Australia. Now, the vine in Australia is grown in 2 or 3 predominant wine regions. The most famous of those would be the Barossa Valley, and the Barossa Valley in South Australia is kind of known as the first growth region of Australia. It's where the finest wines are believed to be grown and produced. It not only produces Shiraz there, there was a German gentleman who really wanted to create a second Bordeaux within Australia. He said, why am I not able to produce as fine wines in Australia, in this area, as I can or as they can in Bordeaux? And that's kind of how it started. And particularly anyone producing Shiraz in that area is known as a Rhone Ranger. Now, in Barossa, there are two main styles of Shiraz that are produced. One, the Rhone Rangers, and they produce this more sort of classic style of Shiraz, so it's slightly lower alcohol. It's black fruit, it's a velvety mouthfeel. When it starts to age, it gets essences of leather and licorice, chocolate maybe, bacon sometimes as well. And then you have the more modern version of Shiraz, which really is probably, in my opinion at least, a bit more how we typically think of Shiraz, and that's fruit forward, full on, voluptuous, velvety red wines. Australia, remember, is a lot warmer than the Rhone region in France. It's a lot further down. It's exposed to far more sunshine, and unless you're playing with altitude and planting your grapes slightly higher, naturally your grapes will have more alcohol in them, and certainly more fruit as well. And that is the more modern sort of full-on Australian style of Shiraz that we know. Other regions in the country that grow it very famously are the Hunter Valley, which is just above Sydney. And there, if you've ever heard that very curious tasting note of sweaty saddles, that is where that tasting note comes from. The Shiraz in that area is thought to be quite leathery, especially when it ages, and sweaty saddles has been a tasting note that has sort of gone viral, if you like. And also Margaret River in Perth, so on the west coast of Australia, they also produce some really, really nice examples of Shiraz as well. Now, where I said the Rhone Valley Syrah vines produce a very sort of telltale element of black pepper, there is also something that Barossa Shiraz in particular produces that can distinguish it from other grapes, and that is this very sort of heady smell, or I think it's heady, herbal smell of eucalyptus. So good telltale sign if you're ever doing a blind tasting, it could be Shiraz, if you smell eucalyptus. And that's not because they add eucalyptus to the vines. They think it's because where a lot of the vines are grown, there's also eucalyptus trees. And this will of course influence the characteristics of the vine and what's going on under the soil as the grapes are being grown as well. Which is my favourite region in Australia. I love a Barossa Valley Shiraz. I'm torn between either style. And I travelled to Australia last year, so for me, I really, really enjoy a Margaret River Shiraz. I don't know, I kind of like the soft voluptuous velvetiness that happens once it's been aged. And for me, when I'm drinking wine or drinking that wine, it throws me right back to my holiday there. Again, like Northern Rhone Syrah, the Australian Shiraz definitely needs a food accompaniment. It's a lot more alcoholic usually, so a good old barbie usually works well. Definitely some red meat if you're a meat eater. If not, mushroom dishes work really well. Just something to really sort of cut through the alcohol, and usually protein is a really good answer for that. Now, if you like the idea of a slightly less alcoholic Shiraz, but you don't want to pay the prices of the Rhone Valley, although you can find different prices there, it is also worth looking into Chile and South Africa, both classed as New World wine producing countries, as they are producing some really elegant styles that they don't mimic the old world style, because everybody is trying to quite rightly find their own individual style, but they are certainly a bit more refined, a bit less fruit forward in their style, and producing some really, really interesting Shirazes or Syrahs from their countries as well. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon is what we'd call the offspring of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. So if you know those two grape varieties, and perhaps you like the sort of sometimes greeny leafy elements that you can get from those, then you're probably going to like Cabernet Sauvignon as well. Cabernet Sauvignon is one of the most planted grape varieties around the world, if not the most planted. I think it's about 720,000 hectares of vineyards across the world. And it's regarded as a noble grape. It's grown everywhere. It has distinct characteristics everywhere it's grown. One of the most well-known aroma compounds, for example, that you can pick up from a Cabernet Sauvignon is blackberry blackcurrant, and particularly when it's young. Now, whereas I mentioned Shiraz or Syrah can be this beautiful sort of inky blue colour in the glass, Cabernet Sauvignon, when it's young, at least tends to be a sort of very bright, brilliant ruby colour. And then as it ages, it will lose colour. It's also very thick-skinned, so it's not necessarily very alcoholic. It holds colour from the skin thickness and the must ratio, again, similar to Shiraz. But it has an incredible potential for aging. And that means also, a little tip, if you ever see a Cabernet Sauvignon that's young, and when I say young, I mean that's being drunk within the same year or the year after its harvest with no aging, it might just be too chewy, it might be too green, because it needs time either in a barrel and or in a bottle to soften out. And just to reduce some of its tannins as well. And when I mean tannins, I mean the sort of dryness that hits our gums when we drink a really full-on red wine. Now, I mentioned it's grown pretty much everywhere, and that is because it's also quite an easy grape to grow. It's not fussy like you might find a Pinot Noir or some of these other grapes that are incredibly sensitive to the slightest change in temperature. It's a hardy grape, so it's a great grape for beginners or wine enthusiasts who want to dare to start growing their own wine as well. China, who is a relatively new wine market compared to many of the other countries, the majority of the grape plantings that they have are actually of Cabernet Sauvignon as well. And although it can grow pretty much anywhere, it does prefer a slightly warmer climate, and it prefers slightly gravelly soils as well. So one of the most famous areas that we'll find Cabernet Sauvignon is of course France. Where else? And in the Bordeaux region, it is particularly famous for being blended with Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot as well sometimes. It's not too common to find Cabernet Sauvignon only as a single varietal in the Bordeaux region. It kind of works better as a structure adding grape to the other grapes in the Bordeaux blend. Other areas around the world that it's become incredibly popular and very well made are New World countries like Chile, for example, Argentina, even Australia. With Chile and Argentina in particular, they play a lot with altitude. So the natural Andes that they have, the mountain range that borders both Chile and Argentina, produce this incredible ability to plant grapes at much higher altitude and have sort of natural irrigation from the snowfall. And what this altitude does is just add freshness to the grape and also helps it retain some of its natural acidity. Cabernet Sauvignon likes warmer climates, I mentioned. It's also a late ripening grape, so it needs a sort of very rounded temperature system, and it holds on to the acidity in the last phase of its maturity, and that's really important. If you leave Cabernet Sauvignon on the vine too long, you'll get a very jammy, uninteresting, what we call a flabby wine. So it's important that it's harvested at the right time, and sometimes these much warmer countries plant slightly higher up to ensure this kind of extra insertion of acidity to the grape. Now, I mentioned Mediterranean climates. Countries like Lebanon and even Israel are also producing really, really good examples of Cabernet Sauvignon. Whether they do them as single varietals or blend them with some of their other native varietals, it doesn't matter. It seems to take very nicely to the terroir in these slightly more southern Mediterranean climates that also have higher altitude as well. Now, anyone who likes Italian wines might know of Cabernet Sauvignon as being included in some of these very ambitious wines, these super Tuscan wines that became popular in about the 1980s. Where they blended Cabernet Sauvignon with things like Sangiovese, and trying to find the exact balance between that quite sort of bitter Sangiovese grape and the more robust Cabernet Sauvignon has been, when it's done right, has been an absolute feat, and it produces incredibly good wines like Sassicaia that you may have heard of, which have incredibly high prices as well to go with them. But certainly Tuscany is regarded by some as the third paradise for Cabernet Sauvignon in the world after Bordeaux and California, which is where we'll move on to next. In Napa and Sonoma, these are particularly great grounds for producing really ripe Cabernet Sauvignon. When they're blended with Bordeaux varieties like Merlot, for example, they tend to be called Meritage. But it's quite popular just to have Cabernet on its own in these two areas. And they produce this sort of very fruity, sometimes earthy. Sometimes actually in Napa you get a minty element, which is quite interesting to the wines as well. But those two areas are known for being the best in America for producing high quality Cabernet Sauvignon. You've got areas like Virginia, for example, and perhaps even Washington, that now have more potential for producing wines of the same standard, but it tends to be California that is sort of the benchmark for that style. Now, in other parts of Europe, we're flitting back to Europe, Cabernet Sauvignon has been incredibly important in the sort of resurgence of the wine industry in places like Romania, Moldova, the Ukraine. Because it's a hardy grape, as I mentioned, and it's late ripening and it's not particularly fussy, it actually works well in, it prefers warm climates, but it actually works well in quite cold climates as well. So even places like Russia have cottoned on to taking Cabernet Sauvignon and being able to produce it to a reasonable standard as well. In warmer parts of mainland Europe, places like Spain, particularly areas like Navarra, are also planting Cabernet Sauvignon. In fact, I think Cabernet Sauvignon in Spain has now possibly overtaken the plantings of Tempranillo. And it's not just planted on its own, it's actually used many times to give some backbone to slightly more fruity, slightly thinner grapes in Spain. Now, I couldn't mention Cabernet Sauvignon without mentioning Australia, of course. Not only is it hugely well known for its Shiraz production, also its Grenache production, for the red wines, but also its Cabernet Sauvignon. This time it's the southeast area of the country in Coonawarra that has this very particular strip of terra rosa earth, very special terroir there, and Cabernet Sauvignon grows there with quite a lot of acidity, making it fabulous as a food wine. It's also grown in areas where the Shiraz grape grows really well as well. So I mentioned Hunter Valley, just above Sydney, in Western Australia, in Margaret River as well, producing sort of fruit-forward, earthy, black fruit, eucalyptus, blackberry, plum as well, chocolate if it's been aged, cedar as well, and sort of pine if it's been aged as well. All of these elements come through from a Cabernet Sauvignon. In terms of combining it with food, I would say 100% do. It is a full-on wine. It can be very tannic, and anything meaty, as I mentioned before, or sort of proteiny would be really, really good. My favorite Cabernet Sauvignon, it really depends a lot on where I am or what I'm eating. I love Cabernet Sauvignon from Lebanon. I think they produce it fabulously well there, usually blended with Sanso. And if not, I really enjoy a high altitude Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon. So there as well, I mentioned in some areas you get the sort of minty element, and it's the same thing that happens when you find a producer who has the altitude in his vineyards to be able to produce slightly less production, so you get more concentrated flavors, but they're produced at a higher altitude. You get this wonderful freshness that comes into the grape that's not overpoweringly fruity. It's not too tannic that you need a knife and fork to eat it, and it just produces a very well-rounded wine, and I would say that's definitely one of my favorites as well. I hope this has been useful into giving you a little insight between the differences between Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon. And I look forward to seeing you the next time. Cheers.